Good morning. Very happy to have this opportunity to welcome you to the first session of the Enology Track seminars here at the 2023 Oregon Wine Symposium. My name is Corey Ganay. I am the Texas sales agent for Tannellery Mercure. I also do a little bit of repping for Mercure here in Oregon. And in 2015, co-founded Core Enology Analytical Services, which is independent analytical lab in McMinnville. Happy to say that 2023 marks my 20-year anniversary in the Oregon wine industry. Thank you. I'm no Joe Dobbs, but it's still pretty cool.
I love you. You're here.
Thanks, dude. Some of you might remember 2003 when the Davisons built their new winery supply building in McMinnville, and ETS sent me up to run their satellite lab. Over the years, had a chance to come to the symposium a number of times. Always a great opportunity to see old friends and get some education and make new friends. I think that's what I'd like to encourage you all to do the next couple days is to make some new friends. All right, with that, we'll get on with the session. Sparkling Continuing Education. Delightful panel. Not sure who put this panel together, but pretty great people. First up, Joe Dobbs, Dundee Mobile Bottling, Iterum Wines, and Dobbs Family Estate. And we have Brianne Day, owner and winemaker of Day Wines. Kate Payne Brown, winemaker, Stoller Family Estate. And then appearing via pre-recording, we have Donnie Brunet from Champagne Boulanger, and the moderator for the session, Alex Nichols, Willikinzie Estate. Alex? All right.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you, Core Enology, and Corey, thank you for everything you do and have done for the industry. And thank all of you for coming today. We are here to talk about bubbles, and I've kind of been calling this seminar like Sparkling Demystified. So ultimately, the goal here is to talk about sort of the range of bubbles that are available and what people are making in Oregon. I think as an industry right now, we're right at this cusp where a number of people are starting to dip their toes into sparkling wines, or maybe they've been doing it for a couple of years, but don't really have a full wrap around the options that may be available to them, or really perhaps what they're getting themselves fully into when they go down the road of bubbles. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the a variety of key components that go into sparkling wine production and the range of sparkling wine production. And we have our three subject matter experts up here to talk about their respective styles and approaches. So Kate Payne Brown is going to go first and speak about traditional method sparkling wine, followed by Brianne Day, who will talk about pet nat. And then we have Joe Dobbs, who will be speaking about forced carb sparkling. So a little bit of a spectrum and a wide variety of techniques, approaches, costs, and time commitments as well. So as you can see up on the screen here, really trying to cover the full spectrum from grape all the way to bottle, and inclusive of the time and energy and effort that goes into this. So I will start by handing it over to Kate, who is going to talk about traditional method sparkling wine. Kate?
Oh, wow. Well, thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be here. I was just saying with our esteemed panelists, it would be way more fun if we all had sparkling wine in front of us. So I want you to take a minute and imagine that you do, because I think we'll be far more entertaining if you imagine yourself drinking bubbles. So I get the great privilege of speaking about traditional method. When I started making wine, what seems like yesterday and 100 years ago all at once, when I left school, I said I was going to focus on making sparkling wine, and a lot of people said, sure you are. And when I came to Oregon in 2007, I really thought that this was an amazing place for sparkling. And there were a lot of people who were doing that. You know, Argyle was setting the stage for making larger production of traditional method sparkling wine. And in 2014, when I came to Stoller, and they said, hey, we want to start a sparkling wine program, I said, oh my God, I thought you would never ask. So it was truly an auspicious moment for me. And at that point, I got right down to work. So for me, making sparkling wine starts in the vineyard. And because we weren't planting a new vineyard at that point, I had to work with what we had. And my first kind of inclination when thinking about sparkling wine is that always start in the vineyard. So because Stoller is a warm growing site, I looked for sections that had that could hold a lot of fruit, that could had a nice airflow, that could leave that I could leave a lot of leaves growing on those vines, and I really just looked for ways to simulate higher elevation and a cooler site. So for me, I started rather than I stopped. I found sections that could hang, 6+ tons to the acre. We declump, but that was a way to slow down the ripening and also mitigate some of the phenolics. So in 2014, we started making about 400 cases, and I did about 80% Pinot Noir and 20% Chardonnay. So when we bring in the fruit, I guess I should say fast forward now to 2022, 2023, we are now up to around almost 3,000 cases of sparkling wine. We do about 60 tons, and we have 3 different varietals that we dedicate towards sparkling wine, and they are Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and a little bit of Pinot Meunier. I like to pick primarily on acidity, mainly because, as I said, we are a warm site, and if I pick on bricks, then usually our acids are pretty low. So generally, though, when I'm out looking at the fruit, I look for a little bit of flavor, but I'm testing the acid. So I look for bricks around 18 to 20, but really I'm looking at the TA, which is normally around 9 to 12 TA. And when we first started doing that, people were like, oh my God, this fruit looks unripe. And for still wine, it probably is. It is. But for sparkling, it worked out really well. So the fruit comes in, it's hand-picked, and then it goes into our cold room. I like to put the fruit, we pick in quarter-ton bins, slotted, and it goes into, we do not sort, it goes into the cold room because I feel like it presses a little bit better. In the morning, when we're ready to press, we load the press. We have a Sigma 8 and a Sigma 16, so just depending upon what size of section comes in that morning, we put it in the press. So I like to do a champagne press cycle. It's around 2 to 3 hours, depending upon the press cuts. And I think that throughout the entire press time, we're often looking at the taste of the wine, but also the pH and looking at if the acidity is decreasing, excuse me. So depending upon the vintage, we could get anywhere from 2 to 3 press fractions. And we keep those press fractions completely separate all the way through and then use that later as blending material. So add around 25 ppm of SO2 and a little bit of liquid nitrogen into the press pan. And then that gets settled overnight. We don't add any enzyme. We just let it naturally settle. I like to have an NTU around 250. If it's above that to 400, that's fine too. It stays in tank for about 12 hours, and then the majority of what we do is fermented in barrels. So we've played around with different size barrels for sparkling wine for fermentation vessels. We've played around with, the regular 228s. We've also started working with a couple of new 600-liter thick stave barrels, which I find are really lovely, especially for our Chardonnay. And then we've even played around with a little bit of cigar barrels as well. I don't know that, they have a tremendous difference in terms of characteristic. Most of our barrels tend to be neutral, but the fermentation trajectory is a little bit different. So from there, our fermentation, we do inoculate. So for the majority of what we do at Stoller, we do not. We do native ferment, but for our sparkling, because everything, any flaws, any kind of anomaly is amplified with sparkling wine later on down the road. So I take the precaution and I inoculate the juice for this. So this, the fermentation takes about 7 to 10 days. Usually we do not have to feed this, but if we have to add a little bit of nutrient, I'm not opposed. And after that, it stays in barrel or in tank if we have a little extra for about 8 to 9 months until we're ready to tirage. In terms of malolactic, malolactic fermentation, it does happen. I don't add any sulfur after we finish primary fermentation. I kind of just let it ride. In some cases, we do have spontaneous malolactic fermentation before we go to tirage. So around 1 month before we tirage, we do finalize our blend. So because we're making 3 different wines, so we make a Blanc de Blanc, a Brut Rosé, which is 80% Pinot Noir, 20% Chardonnay, and we make a non-vintage, which the varietal composition changes every round of that wine. So right now we're on round 3, and who's to say what we're going to put together? It's usually, primarily Pinot Noir, but it's got some Chardonnay and a little bit of Meunier. We only have 1 acre of Meunier on the property, and so I would love to have more. But it's really nice to have those different components especially for this style of sparkling wine that we make. So come April, May, June, depending upon whether or not our glass gets here, is kind of when we're kind of determines when we're going to tirage. For those of you that use Flint, you know the pain of having to continually push off your bottle lane runs, which is also why we've moved to antique green for our sparkling wine for a number of reasons. But yeah, we usually tirage around that time. And the tirage culture is really, in my opinion, one of the hardest moments in terms of making traditional method sparkling wine. It's 4 days of making sure that you're doing cell counts, you're looking at the density, you're paying attention to building this culture you're looking at it every, I don't know if we are 10 hours, 12 hours. So just to ensure that you have something to put in your tirage bottle when you do that. So for those of you who don't know, tiraging is the point where you add sugar and yeast to the bottle, and that is ultimately what is going to provide your effervescence, your carbonation later. So we add around 24 grams per liter of sugar and a little bit of DAP to our base wine when we're ready to bottle. And then we hopefully, after about 1 month, 4 to 6 weeks, we have about 6 atmospheres of pressure. At that point, it's technically sparkling wine. For those of you who have not had sparkling wine at that point, it's effervescent, the bubbles are kind of clunky, it's really not that interesting. But what makes it interesting is time on lees. So I'll back up. When we tirage, we use a crown cap, and then we have started stacking into gyro pallets. So it was a big investment up front, but then that mitigates double handling, and also it is a safety precaution as well, so we don't have to take the tiraged bottles out of wooden bins and put them into cages later. I think that, I've seen way too many accidents with those tiraged bottles at 6 atmospheres, which are like little bombs, so we take a lot of precautions on that front end. So for us, we do, our bottles spend anywhere from 1 year to 4 years on tirage. And in fact, we have some that are on tirage lees longer. We've held back some extended tirage. But for the most part, our largest SKU, our non-vintage, spends about 1 year on lees. So we started, when we started thinking about how to build our sparkling program, I felt it was important to have a non-vintage or a multi-vintage because we could hold back material over different vintages and build palate that way rather than relying on time on lees in order to fatten the palate. So the non-vintage, we started in 2019, and it's been a really nice inclusion into our portfolio because the wine is a bit more fruit forward. You have, as we build the reserve material, it provides different characteristic to the wine rather than the brioche-ness. You get this roundness from the reserve wine, but not necessarily all the yeasty characteristics, which for a wine that is sold directly to the public at a slightly lower price point, it's been really beneficial for us. So as we're getting ready to, after 1 to 4 years, depending upon the program, we start riddling. So riddling is the process which you move the yeast that has settled at the bottom of those bottles after fermentation, secondary fermentation, and move them down to the neck of the bottle. So traditionally, by hand, it takes around 6 to 8 weeks. But for us, we invested in gyro pallets, mainly because we didn't want to dedicate somebody to doing that for 6 to 8 weeks. And the cycle for the gyro pallet is about 1 week. So depending upon the size of the case count of the wine, it could take anywhere from 3 to 7 weeks to move through around 2,500 cases or more of wine. So prior to disgorging, we start the dose trial process. So I think this is one of, blending and thinking about the wine and sitting and having the time to be contemplative is always wonderful, but looking at dose trials is one of my favorite times of the year because you're looking at variable rates of not just sugar level, but also vehicle wine. So vehicle wine, meaning it's a wine that you blend with the sugar that you're gonna add if you choose to in order to balance the wine. And so just a little bit of just a change in vehicle wine is going to have an enormous impact on the wine. And we look at all of it blind. So to me, dosage is not necessarily not to add sweetness to the wine. I like Peter Liam's analogy in that it brings balance to the wine, much like adding salt to cooking. You're not looking to bring out a lot of sweetness, you're looking to bring out the perfect balance, the acidity that you have. So we do about, for each wine, we look at, 3 different vehicle wines, and, we start with a pretty broad range of dosage levels. So we could start at 0 grams, and then we go all the way up to 8 grams usually, and we taste that blind over a period of time. And we look at it multiple times. I think I don't think you can make a decision in that day because personalities change. I think your mood changes. I think that giving yourself the time to make sure that your decision is the best one takes a lot of dedication, and then also it takes just going back and looking at it blind to make sure that you are consistent. So then when we decide on the dose and we're getting ready to disgorge, we add around 10 ppm of sulfur to our dose liqueur. It binds any aldehydes. If there's anything, it kind of promotes freshness. So the nitty-gritty for disgorging. So disgorging, we go to a neck freezer. It's around negative 25 degrees. Then from the neck freezer, it goes to the disgorging line, and the crown cap is popped, the yeast is liberated, the dose is added. What I should say is that you have to make sure before you tirage that your wine is cold stabilized. I've learned this the hard way, that if your wine is not cold stabilized before it goes on to tirage, then you have excitable bottles, you have nucleation sites that later when you add the dose to the wine, it's gonna gush. And we've tried lots of different ways to mitigate that, but I found the best possible way is to ensure that your wine is very cold stable before it goes to bottle. For us, after the dose is added, we top it up and then it gets corked, a wire hood gets applied, and then we usually finish packaging in line, mainly to, again, handle or touch the bottle less times. So the wine for us is released 3 months to a year after disgorging, depending upon which SKU we are disgorging. And so down to aging and cost. So I think sparkling wine has tremendous aging capability. We are always looking at the bottles. Now since we started in 2014, we have material that's almost a decade old, and it's great to see. I think they are still just as fresh and just as interesting as they were when we first tiraged them. And cost, I think there is a lot of cost applied to sparkling wine. And I think that's what makes a lot of people nervous getting into this segment of winemaking. And I think that having somebody like the wonderful Andrew Davis, if he's here, provide the infrastructure and the bottling line and the mobile units to make that accessible is a huge help. But I think the majority of our cost is applied or comes from the vineyard and from just production costs in general for making wine in the facility that we make wine in. And then the packaging cost is about 12%. So yeah, for us, it was really great to do this exercise because I really thought that looking at the cost, our costs would be so much higher to make sparkling wine, and what I found was that it wasn't. It wasn't necessarily as high as I thought it would be. I think it was more so the time in terms of labor and looking at that and looking at how many times that you have to work with the wine and touch one single bottle multiple times. But I think for me, it's worth it, and I'm glad to see that this area, this segment of wine is growing in the valley. So, thank you. Any questions?
I don't know. Yeah, there we are. Thank you, Kate. So, quick housekeeping. I trust that everybody has downloaded the Whova app and you all have it readily available. So feel free to put questions up on the app and I'll be able to see them as each of the panelists are speaking. We can also collect them for the end if there are any questions that you don't think of while each member is speaking. I do have a question though, Kate.
Imagine that.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, goodness.
So
My favorite color is yellow.
So when you started working with sparkling wines, you were working with Andrew Davis from Radiant Sparkling Wine to start. Was there a point that you found the production volume was enough to commit to purchasing equipment for Stoller?
That's a great question. I think because we had intended on growing not only the traditional method, but we also intended on growing a forced carbonated product as well. It made sense for us to purchase a disgorging line, and a forced carbonated bottling line, and have all the equipment in-house. So there wasn't an aha moment, at least that I was privy for, or with the accounting. It was kind of like, well, if we're building a new bottling line, we have the ability to add disgorging. Would you be amenable to bringing that in-house? And I said, absolutely. And it's been a huge learning curve, for sure. Yeah, some of the different pieces of equipment don't easily communicate with each other, despite them all speaking Italian. So it's been interesting, but I think we're getting the hang of it, and I think, I think for us, it has allowed us to do things like tiraging all in gyro pallet cages, and disgorging on different disgorgement levels or different disgorgement dates, and playing around with the different styles of sparkling wine that way.
And so you find that the pain in the ass factor of having the equipment is worth it for the sake of flexibility and being able to do things the way that you want to ultimately?
Yes.
Yes.
I
Yes.
do. Thank you for making it succinct. But yes, I agree that having it in-house has allowed us greater flexibility and has allowed us to schedule in a different way. Andrew was always very accommodating, but it was like, what if we just disgorged 40 cases? And I didn't want to do that to him. So we're able to spread out our disgorging if we want to, although some days it's kind of like, let's just get it all done.
So you also talked on cold stability for wines. One question that I've heard come up a few times is, what about heat stability? Do you do anything about heat stability prior to going to bottle at tirage?
No, I do not.
Why?
I think with heat stability, you run the risk of, you can have problems with your mousse retention, and so you need the proteins. And so we played around with a lot of different ways to cold stabilize. What we do now is use Zenith, because the wine doesn't have to be heat stable to the nth degree. And it also ensures that the wine is stable when we go to disgorge, and hopefully longer than that.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate. You talked a little bit about disgorging, and you talked about a small addition of SO2 that you make at that point in time to promote freshness, bind up aldehyde. So Denis Brunet from Champagne Bollinger has done quite a bit of research on disgorging. They've put heaps of time, energy, and effort into researching their approaches to disgorging. So we do have a video, a pre-recorded video from Denis. And they looked at a couple different approaches to disgorging that he will talk about. I won't ruin the ending for you. So if we could flip over to the video for Denis, that would be fantastic.
So hi everybody, I'm Denis Bunner, a winemaker at Champagne Bollinger. I'm very happy to be with you today. Unfortunately, not in live, but I wanted to share with you some champagne information today in this Oregon Wine Symposium. So thank you first of all for the organization to invite me today. Just a little bit of background before I start. When I started in Champagne 20 years ago, I used to work at the CIVC for almost 10 years. And then I joined Bollinger. And now it's 10 years also that I am at Bollinger, half period, 10 years at the CIVC and 10 years at Bollinger. And I had the chance to work on a very interesting topic in both house, at the CIVC, the Champagne Committee, and at Bollinger, regarding the importance of disgorgement on the champagne. So today we are going to speak about this subject, and I decided to give you, before we start to speak about disgorgement, a little bit of background about who is Bollinger, what we are doing, and a little bit historical facts regarding this subject of disgorgement in the house of Bollinger. So first part is history. Bollinger was founded in 1829 by three men, Jacques Bollinger, Athanase de Villarmont, and Paul Renaudin. And 2 generations later, another Jacques Bollinger married a famous lady for the house, which is Madame Bollinger. This woman really marked the house because she was a visionary woman, really focused on the quality of the wine. So she took over in 1941 until 1971, and she developed the brand internationally. When her husband died in 1941, she took over the house and she was the lady president for almost 30 years. And she's the one who created some prestigious cuvées like Vieille Vigne Française and also Bollinger RD. RD stands for recently disgorged. She's also the one, Madame Bollinger, who created the Bollinger style. She created the 5 pillars of the house. I mean, the vineyard, the Pinot Noir, the fact that we are dominated by this grape variety. The first fermentation in barrels is also something she preserved in the house, because nowadays it has almost disappeared in Champagne. And finally, the reserve wine are kept in magnums. And this is very particular to Champagne Bollinger. And the last part, the last pillar, is the time. The fact that we are aging all the cuvées twice the normal time compared to the Champagne appellation. So coming back to Madame Bollinger now, and how she impacted the house. So I already mentioned that she created the famous cuvée Bollinger RD. RD stands for recently disgorged. And she had at this time in 1967 already the intuition that the disgorgement is really important during the elaboration of champagne. This is the last step of elaboration. And she called this cuvée RD. That means that she already knew that this is important for an important step for the champagne. She had the intuition that at this step of winemaking of the champagne, there is an oxygen impact And that's why she underlined the importance of disgorgement. And actually, we are the house. She is the first who proposed to indicate on the label the date of disgorgement on the main label, to underline two major things to understand the champagne. With the disgorgement date, you can you know how much time the champagne has aged on lees before disgorgement, and also for the consumers, it gives another important information. It gives the information on how long the champagne, when it was disgorged, and how long it has rest after disgorgement. So she focused a lot on when it was disgorged to give two important information to the consumers. And today we are going to speak about not only the date, but how it is disgorged, not only when, but how. And we are going to see the impact of oxygen ingress at disgorgement and how it impacts the champagne, and why it is very important to manage this oxygen ingress during this important step of the life of champagne. So just to give you the context, you have at different moment of the life of the champagne in bottle, different gas exchanges, I mean oxygen and CO2. The first step is the aging in bottle, the aging on lees under a metallic cap or a cork. For Bollinger, we use both, a metallic cap for the non-vintage and a cork maintained with a staple on all the vintages. And finally, we have gas exchanges through the metallic cap or the cork during the aging, and also we have the same gas exchanges between the bottle and the atmosphere when after the final corking. And in between, you have the disgorgement. The particular thing about the disgorgement is that it lasts only a few minutes, whereas the aging period can last, for example, for RD, it can last 14 years on lees. So that's a very long time compared to the disgorgement, which can last only a few minutes. So we are going to focus now on this step of disgorgement. So for a long time, the Champenois thought that when you open the bottle, they thought for a long time that the bottle is protected by the CO2 inside the bottle. You know that you have 6 bars of pressure inside the bottle at 10 degrees. And all the Champenois thought that the champagne and the headspace is protected by this CO2. But when I was working at the CIVC, we proved that it was false, that oxygen can enter into the neck of the bottle and accumulate depending how long the bottle will stay open before the final corking. So to measure this oxygen and to assess, we had at the CIVC an instrument called Orbisphere, and we have also the same at Bollinger's laboratory. So it consists to introduce a sensor into the bottles and to suck the champagne into a system that will be and the champagne will be analyzed under nitrogen. To make an oxygen assessment at the disgorgement, the only tool that exists is the Orbisphere to take one sample of the champagne and analyze inside a sensor. And that's how we can make a oxygen assessment at disgorgement. So disgorgement, you have to know that before disgorgement, in the bottle, you have 0 oxygen because when oxygen tries to enter into the bottle through the metallic cap, the wine is consuming oxygen very quickly. So before disgorgement, you have always 0 oxygen inside the bottle. But when you open, oxygen can enter, and it can represent 0 to 10 milligram per liter, so the saturation. And the oxygen enter only in the headspace of the bottle. You cannot have a direct dissolution, because that solution is possible, but you have to shake the bottle. So on the disgorgement line, oxygen can enter only into the neck of the bottle. And after the closure, if you shake the bottle, then the oxygen will dissolve from the headspace into the liquid, into the champagne. And after disgorgement, depending how much oxygen you have dissolved, between 0 and 10, you will have different evolution on the same batch of bottle. And as a result, only after 6 months, you can have a very different profile, more or less oxidized. So this is a problem, an issue when you disgorge, is to manage this oxidation and to manage the level of oxygen that enter into the neck of the bottle. Just to give you a few more information, when you disgorge, you can have more or less foam on the bottle, as you can see on the picture. Here I did some measures. You can see that the oxygen that enter into the neck of the bottle is perfectly correlated to the height of the foam. Without any foam in this trial, we have a 2.8 milligram per liter of oxygen that enter into the neck of the bottle. And at the other extreme, you have here the same wine the same day, but the wine was corked on foam, and you have only 0.1. So depending the height of the foam in the neck of the bottle, the foam, I mean the mousse, in the neck of the bottle, you have more or less oxygen after the corking. So for example, in this case, which is really interesting, you have 0.8, the foam, the mousse is at the level of the ring. So it means here in this stage. So for example, here the foam is above, you have 0.1. Here, if you have the foam at the ring, you will have 0.8. So it's perfectly correlated. And the more you let the bottle open, the more oxygen you will have. So there is two main parameters that can vary the oxygen ingress during the disgorgement, is the time of opening and the level of the foam, depending if you have foam or not, if the bottle are shaking together or not on the line. So for example, here you have after 5 and 10 minutes, here after when you disgorge directly, you have 1.5 milligram per liter. After 5 minutes, the same wine, the same bottle, you have 4.9. And here after 10 minutes, for example, if you have a break on the line, you will have 5.9 milligram per liter. And this is huge. To give you an idea, during the aging on lees, through the metallic cap, in average, you have 0.6 milligram per liter of oxygen that can enter into the bottles per year. So it means that in only a few seconds, here, for example, if you disgorge and you cork just after, you have already the equivalent of 2 years of oxygen ingress on lees through the metallic cap, only a few seconds. So the solution now, in Champagne, everybody used to add SO2. At Bollinger, we don't use SO2. I will explain you why later. But in the general case, to fight the oxygen ingress, people are using SO2. so can be between 15 to 30 milligrams per liter added in the liquor. And during the dosage, this SO2 will enter into the bottle with the liquor and will protect the wine. The only thing is that this oxygen, depending how much oxygen is entered, this SO2 will not have the same impact. For example, here above, with oxygen ingress, so with 2 milligrams per oxygen per liter, if you don't put SO2, you will have here more or less oxidation. Oxidation is represented by the orange color. So neutral is the yellow light, and then the orange represents oxidation. So if you have oxygen ingress without SO2, you will have an evolution on the oxidation. With SO2, you can see that if you have with oxygen and with SO2, the SO2 will fight the oxidation, and the profile of the champagne is in majority neutral. This residual thing is maybe the panel effect, because the panel needs to be probably aligned. But here you see that the SO2 can really reestablish the profile of the wine and is not oxidized and not neither on the reduction, which is the green part. Let's take now the example of a bottle which has been disgorged, and the bottles, for example, you have where corked on foam. You will have a very low oxygen ingress, and we are going to see the effect now. So with SO2, but without oxygen ingress, you will have a high level of reduction. And without SO2 and without oxygen, you will be mostly neutral. The conclusion of this slide is to show you that SO2 is a good thing if you have oxygen. If you don't have oxygen in the bottle, this SO2 will not be consumed by oxygen, but will produce some sulfur components in the champagne, and you will change the profile of the champagne. The champagne will be more reductive. This is this case with SO2, but without oxygen ingress. That means that SO2 is a good thing to fight oxygen, but creates heterogeneity between the bottles. And this is the main issue of disgorgement, is to preserve the homogeneity between the bottles. And SO2 is not a good solution regarding this issue. I mean, SO2 is going to work very well if you have oxygen, but if the bottle is corked on foam, it will orient the champagne on a more reductive evolution. So we developed at the CIVC, and when I joined Bollinger, we installed a new solution that avoid to use SO2, and that's why we don't use SO2 at Bollinger at disgorgement, because we installed here a solution which is called the jetting. This idea comes from the brewery industry, and it consists, as the video will show you, to inject a little drop of wine into the neck of the bottle. And you see the foam is going up, and the foam, by going up, will remove the oxygen from the bottle. So the jetting consists of injecting a little drop of wine or sterilized water, only 50 microliters, into the neck of the bottle, so 1 drop per bottle, and it will provoke a foam, and the foam, by going up, will remove the oxygen from the neck of the bottle. So that's how we manage the oxygen at Bollinger. And here you have a picture on the instrument. It's very easy. And we installed this instrument in 2014. And we don't use anymore SO2 at disgorgement, because for the profile, the Bollinger taste and the Bollinger style, we don't use SO2. We don't need SO2. So this solution of jetting is really interesting compared to the SO2, because it will prevent the champagne from strong oxidation, because you will have less than 1 milligram of oxygen into the champagne after disgorgement, whatever, how long the bottle will be opened. Because if the bottle is open 1, 5 or 10 minutes, you will have more or less oxygen into the neck, but thanks to the jetting, this oxygen will be removed from the neck, and you will have the same oxygen level, whatever the bottle, without any SO2. So I think that's an interesting solution, because you use the CO2 from the bottle to create the foam and to remove the oxygen without adding any SO2. But that depends the profile of the sparkling wine you want to achieve. You can still use a little bit of SO2, but for sure, the jetting technique will allow you to reduce the use of SO2 or to remove it completely, depending the profile you want to achieve. So that is what I wanted to say to you today. I hope that I was not too long. I think 20 minutes already. So unfortunately, I'm not here live to answer your question, but probably the organization can give you my email address, and we can exchange later by email. So thank you very much again for the organizer to invite me, and have a nice symposium. Bye bye.
Okay. So I thought one of the things I thought was really interesting about the solution that Champagne Bollinger came up with is adapting something relatively simple, but pulling it from a different industry and applying it to the wine world. I think we don't do that all that often, and ultimately, it solves a problem for Bollinger that they were dealing with, and it's remarkably simple. Brianne and I chatted a little bit prior to this about simplicity and the concept of simplicity when it comes to sparkling wines. So as we walked through the traditional method, it can be complex. There's a lot of steps, there's a lot of stuff going on, and a lot to be considering. And that's not to say that the same is not the case for PetNat, but I think Brianne has a really interesting approach to sparkling wines, and I will hand it over to her to speak accordingly.
Am I on? Yes? Okay. Hi, I'm Brianne Day from Day Wines, and it's a new experience for me to be sitting on a panel as though I'm an expert at something, so bear with me with this. I started making PetNat in 2014. It was my third commercial vintage, and I had, to my knowledge, nobody else was making it in the state at that time. I came across the style while traveling, and I had been traveling around the world in 06 and 07, and when I was in Paris on that trip, had some PetNats made by Loire Valley winemakers, and liked them. I liked their vibrancy, I liked their character, I liked the texture, and I liked the simplicity. And in 2014, I was talking with Herb Quaddy in Southern Oregon about different fruit that he had available, and he had some Malvasia Bianca that I wanted to work with, and he was the one that suggested you should try making this sparkling. I've had sparkling Malvasia before, and it triggered that memory in my mind of having PetNat in France and in northern Italy, and I thought, that looks easy. I think I'm gonna try doing that. So simplicity was definitely something that made me wanna try making that. And over the years, without having anybody to ask questions from or how to do stuff, it was a matter of trial and error for many vintages. And so some vintages early on particularly were less refined than how I try to make it today. There was more sediment, there was less predictability with the carbonation, and then over the years, I've kind of dialed it into a place where I feel like it's a more repeatable exercise each year. That first wine being varietally driven in terms of creating the style was something that I've done a lot of since then, and I really try to make grape varieties dictate how wines are made, what style they happen to be, whether they be sparkling or orange or white or red or whatever they are. And I think that that's a good method to follow with starting with pet nat, is to pick the right variety for it and not necessarily assume that every grape variety is going to be useful in that manner or you know, work well in that manner. The simplicity of it and the basicness of it is going to make this a shorter version, a shorter little how-to, and that's good with me. So to jump right in on that, slide. I'm supposed to be doing this. Yeah, you could be, Joe can be my assistant here. When picking, starting in the vineyard obviously is also the number one thing, starting with the grape variety, starting with the farming. All the fruit that I work with is farmed organically and biodynamically, or biodynamically. And I think that can help with some of the indigenous fermentations that we're using in all of our wines. I like the acid to be brighter. It's not quite to the levels that Kate was talking about with how she's doing her method. I'm more looking for something that's going to result in a final ABV of like 11 to 12% and a final pH of like 3.2, somewhere around then. So we're picking at like 20 to 21 bricks. TA's typically like 6.5 and over. And currently I'm working with Vermentino and Muscat from my pet nat. The Malvasia that I had been working with from Herb had to be ripped out due to some disease pressure. And so if you know of anybody that wants to plant me some Malvasia, I would be really into that because I loved working with that grape. So we bring the fruit in. Sometimes it's chilled, sometimes it's not. It's mostly coming from Southern Oregon. I don't own any vineyards, so I'm working with growers, and not everything is up to me in terms of how fruit comes in. I have ideals, but it's not the same as having an estate vineyard that you can make those decisions yourself as much. And I do want to just back up for a second. I wanted to say that I think it's really cool that we are being included, that this kind of wine is being included at the Oregon Wine Symposium, because there are a lot of these wines that are now being made in Oregon, even if they are in really small quantities, and it's nice to have it be a part of the conversation and hopefully elevate that style and have it so it's not such a trial and error for small producers that are making wines like this, but have it be, you know, more collaborative and hopefully make better and better wines over time because of that. So anyhow, back to what I was talking about. So we bring the fruit in. I'm not very precious with the pressing of it. I'm pressing a kind of a normal white cycle because The varieties themselves that I like to work with for PetNat are in such small quantity, I want to get as much juice out of the grapes as I can. So I'm pressing to a pretty normal cycle without really doing any kind of press fractions or anything like that. The caveat on that is unless there is smoke in the area, and Southern Oregon does have smoke in the area kind of, you know, on occasion. If there is smoke in the area, I'm a lot more careful about the pressing. If it's a smoke-free vintage, going up to 2 bar for a cycle is fine with me. If it's not a smoke-free vintage, then I'd never go really above 1.4. It seems to be my spot where I notice the smoke actually in the juice. I notice like the astringency of it, and so that's where I make the cut. This year I used sulfur in the juice for the first time. I don't typically use sulfur in the juice. I did about 20 ppm of SO2 in the press pan this year because there was some bird damage in the vineyard and I didn't want to have VA in my wine. But typically I've not used sulfur at any point in making this wine. It's racked to stainless steel and goes through an initial chilling for just the heavy lees, and then racked from that to another stainless steel tank and allowed to be kind of naturally brought up to temperature and start fermenting spontaneously that way. Multiple rackings and using cold, using chilling as a method of clarifying has proven to be kind of clutch for this wine style. I think it was 2015, must have been 2015, I had more sediment than I could sell, and so I disgorged it, and that was also with the help of Andrew Davis, and that was the only vintage that I've disgorged, and the ideal is to try to make it so you're not disgorging it, and the only way to do that is through multiple rackings and multiple settlings. To my knowledge, that's the only way to do it. Watching the sugar levels in the juice really carefully, particularly as they start creeping down, is pretty clutch because there's also no dosage in PetNat. And so typically I'm going to be racking the wine 3 or 4 times throughout fermentation, and then when it gets to around 1 degree Brix, really monitoring the sugar levels carefully, and I do it at the lab as opposed to in-house after that point. So Corey's lab gets my samples like probably 3 or 4 times a week, particularly this time of year, because you don't want to overshoot the fermentation and miss that really sweet spot window of when it goes into the bottle with the right amount of pressure and the right amount of sediment, which hopefully is like very little, actually. I like the wine to be fairly clear, and but with this fermentation happening in bottle, there is some sediment there. So when I get into that zone of right around where my wine from this vintage is still not bottled, which is a little late for me, but it's sitting at about 0.2 Brix. That's like almost every other day, get a glue-frou from the lab, and when it gets to like about 12 grams per liter, I do a hard chill on it for about a week, and then we hand bottle it on a 6-bottle filler and put it under crown cap and put it into a slightly warmer section of the winery and wait for about 6 to 8 weeks, and then pop the first cap and see if it's bubbling. And if it is, then I slap labels on them and sell it. Just start selling it right then. I labeled at bottling that year in 2015 when I had to disgorge, and that was a mess. We had to soak all the labels off and reapply them and pay for them again. So I recommend waiting until you know what the sediment levels and carbonation levels are going to be if you don't want to have to clean things up and redo it. But it's a really straightforward, pretty easy way to do it, and it's something that the market seems to be excited about and wanting to support. So it's a valuable little way to make sparkling wine. What were we talking about here? Oh, aging. Yeah, I've had the first vintages that we made in 2014. I've had them recently, and they're still fresh and vibrant and have carbonation. And as far as I can tell, there's potential for it to age, but not having had super old pet nats, I'm not certain what the long-term ageability of it, but based on my wine, 8 to 10 years seems to be working so far. And in terms of like flint glass or green glass or what is used, I've gone back and forth on it. There was a period of time where I switched to using green glass because I got tired of talking about the sediment in it when I was out doing sales, and if you put it in dark glass, you don't have to talk about it as much with wine buyers, but it seemed like everybody wanted to see it, so then I went back over to flint. So that's where we are now. We don't make a lot of it. I only make about 150-ish cases every year. I think that is a choice. It's that every winery has to make, like, what do I want to do versus what can I sell? Because I think in terms of selling it, it would be pretty easy to make a large amount of it and sell a large amount of it, but it is laborious and it is time consuming, and in terms of selling it through distribution versus selling it direct, the margins are pretty slim, so I've chosen to sell everything direct and not go through distributors, so it's all through my wine club or through my tasting room directly from the winery, and that's the choice that I made because I didn't want to make mass-produced pet nat. It just doesn't appeal to me and doesn't really pencil out in terms of your margins. So from the standpoint of is it more expensive than still wine to make, the fruit oftentimes is less expensive for me because I'm not using varieties that are as premium or as in high demand. So that helps with things, but your taxes on your per gallon basis, and the glass itself is quite a bit more expensive and really cuts into the margin for me. So another reason why I'm just trying to make smaller amounts. And that's all I got.
Awesome. Thank you, Brienne.
Sure.
So one question that came up in the on the app that I think applies to both Kate and Brienne here is when you are bottling, how do you keep the wine suspended, or how do you keep the yeast suspended during your bottling process? I'll throw that to you first, Kate.
We have used a couple different methods. We've used a Guth, which is helpful if you have a ball valve and a Guth. And we've also used nitrogen that we've fashioned an apparatus that we made. I don't have a picture of it, but that goes through the bottom of the tank and a conical shaped bottling tank. So in order to keep it suspended. So
Perfect. Brienne?
I don't do anything.
Fermentation kind of does it, huh?
Yeah, I don't do it.
Perfect. Cool. Okay, so we've spent a fair amount of time talking about getting bubbles into bottles by fermenting inside that bottle. And Joe is here to talk about doing it a little bit differently. So Joe, take it away.
Good afternoon, and I'm happy to be here. This is the first seminar I've done in a long time, and I've never made pet nat. I'm not brave enough to do it, so my hat's off to you. And I'm new to method traditional, starting in 2019 with my Itirum wines, small small organically farmed stuff. So why am I doing Dundee Mobile Bottlers? After I started in the business in 1985 and 86, I did the 85 vintage in Germany. I was a Praktikant in Langenlonsheim, West Germany. And somehow, when I came back in 1986, I had the idea of starting a mobile bottling company. And I think I saw a mobile bottler there, so a lot of years ago. And at the time, I didn't have the wherewithal, financially or from an experience standpoint to pursue something like that. So fast forward a lot of years, I got my first head winemaking job in '89 after being in Burgundy in '88. Moved on, working at several different wineries. And in 2002, I had the bright idea of starting my own winery, Dobbs Family Estate. And then Wine by Joe followed on the following vintage, 2003. And we're using mobile bottlers. I'd used mobile bottlers at other companies years prior. So why did I start a mobile bottling company? A friend of mine says that I'm a hopeless serial entrepreneur. So maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I saw an opportunity for another mobile bottling company in Oregon that could also do something with some competitive advantages that others cannot do, and specifically that is inline forced carbonation and or bottling of pre-carbonated product out of bright tanks. So we were doing a couple hundred, 250,000 cases at Wine by Joe, and I saw an opportunity to save some money for the company and start a new business, so here I am. I'm not here to do an infomercial on Dundee Mobile Bottlers, but this is the lens under which I do forced carbonation, et cetera. So this is right here a shot of one of our 2 mobile bottling lines. So this is what we call the mothership. It's actually a mobile facility, and I see a couple customers of ours in here. The main difference between this line and the other mobile bottlers is we're using an electro-pneumatic counter-pressure filler, so you need the counter-pressure to keep the carbonation in the product when you're going in the bottle. We also use counter-pressure for still wines also. So this is a setup up in Washington State that you're looking at right now for inline carbonation. So by inline, I mean you take a still wine that's in the cellar. Let me back up a little bit. So the mothership is the left-hand bottling line. So that has a 20-spout electro-pneumatic counter-pressure filler in it. And so for the carbonation process, we go through the chase trailer, and I'll show another picture here, actually up back. There we go. That is the Padovan carbonator. So anybody that's doing inline carbonation is using something like this. And you can see the red hoses on the top in the left-hand slide. That's coming, that's inside the chase trailer there. You can see the doors open, and there's a 7.5 horsepower chiller that gets the product very, very cold, like 32 degrees. So we can bottle pre-carbonate or pre-chilled or ambient. We could show up and bottle, Chardonnay all day for you and say, all right, how many cases of sparkling do you want? And then we go after the sparkling. So if you were to do bright tank or pre-carbonated product, the chase trailer goes away. So that chase trailer also has a 90 kilowatt generator in it and a 7.5 horsepower chiller, as I said. So the Padovan, as I said, is an absolute necessity. In the right-hand slide there, you can see the round surge tank. And that's imperative for high-quality impingement of bubbles into your product. And I'll talk more about that later. In the left-hand slide in the very front, you can see a heat exchanger. So the chiller then, the ambient temperature or pre-chilled wine comes in, goes through that heat exchanger, and is chilled down to approximately 32 degrees. Other equipment in there, we've got, of course, a labeler, a fobber, or the jetting. So that's a process we can do. Closure ability is crown cap, screw cap, conventional cork, champagne cork, ROPP, roll-on pilfer proof, and Stelvin, of course. So Stelvin P for pressure. There's also Stelvin P for pasteurization. And I'll talk a lot more about those. One of the advantages of, and I'll get into it later, but with the inline carbonation is you can pinpoint the exact amount of CO2 that you're putting in the bottle. So you can actually do some sweet spotting for CO2. It works great. Before I talk more about carbonation, et cetera, I need to, where to go? Inline carbonation. I lost track of my slides. Farming. There we go. So I have the advantage of going last, so the farming has really been discussed. The parameters are really the same for forced carbonating or inline or pre-carbonated in bright tanks. A lot of our customers the bottling will be maybe an afterthought. So it's like, oh, I've got a little bit of extra wine, maybe I'm going to put some bubbles into it, or I've got a wine maybe that's got some problems, et cetera. In my opinion, if you're farming with intent for any of the wines that you're making, you're going to be ahead of the game. So in an ideal world, it's my opinion and my suggestion, if you're really looking to do a high-end inline pre-carbonated or inline carbonated sparkling product, is farm it with the intent of giving it an opportunity to become a wine. Give it some time on the lees, give it some aging time, et cetera, before you put it in the bottle. Let it become wine. As far as preparing the wines can be ambient or they can be pre-chilled. It's a little bit easier if they're pre-chilled because that delta where we need to go to get the CO2 dissolved into the wine is less. And one of the big no-nos is do not pre-carbonate. We have some clients that have pre-carbonated their product and it causes a lot of explosions. So, blowing bubbles into a glass of freshly poured beer doesn't work, right? So it foams all over the place. Packaging. This is imperative. So with Dundee Mobile Bottlers, we've got clients that have wanted to go above 5 atmospheres. That's a buku amount of pressure. We have really kind of said, hey, look, we're going to keep it at 5 because you end up having a lot of low fills and people are unhappy. And it's like, well, hey, we told you so. So, listen to your bottler. We go up to 5 atmospheres easily with crown cap. We can do tirage bottling, of course, Stelvin, the P for pressure, and roll-on pilfer proof, champagne cork and wire hood, of course. No problems going up to 5 atmospheres. And then something that a lot of people probably don't know is, you get into frizzantes or semi-sparkling kind of wines. A Stelvin screw cap is rated up to about 2.5 atmospheres. And so we have some people that are doing wines that are lightly carbonated, and it works really well under that. The Stelvin P, they said you can go up to 5 atmospheres. We don't really recommend that at all, though. And then conventional cork, also for semi-sparkling wines. Years ago, I made a frizzante style, like a semi-sparkling muscat at Willamette Valley Vineyards and Hinman Vineyards many years ago. And so I went to school, I went to the store, bought some bottles and said, all right, what are they doing with this cork? So you can go with an oversized cork, and then you have a special bottle that has a reverse taper. So basically that cork is really smashed at the neck and it's like a mushroom at the bottom, fanned out, and it will not come out of the bottle. It works really well. So packaging for inline and pre-carbonated is a challenge. From a cost standpoint, you've got thicker bottles. You need to pay attention to the size of the crown cap that you're going to put on it, 26 or 29. Your mobile bottler or whomever you may be bringing the product to get bottled is probably only outfitted to do one of the two of those. We do 26 millimeter. We had to choose. One of the biggest issues with bottling when you're very cold like this is the sweating of the bottle. The ambient temperature, the dew point, all plays a role, but I can guarantee you if you're putting something into the bottle around 32, 40, 34 degrees, it's going to sweat. And at the very end then, Craftsman Label, you'll see some information. It's a company that we recommend highly that has a bulletproof label that will actually adhere underwater in a cold, sweaty bottle. And the cool thing is also it won't end up slipping out of the bottle won't end up slipping off the bottle when you've got it in an ice bucket. So the glue combination with it's like a Mylar kind of acetate product. Works really well. If any of you have seen Brew Doctor, they use that. It works really well. Hawksview Winery uses it, and other people that we bottled for. So as far as ageability, it's really I would say ageability is highly dependent upon as many things as Pet Nat and Method Traditional is take care of the wine up front and it'll reward you later, right? So really pay attention to what you're doing. I would say, for a certain extent, inline forced carbonated product, what is the ageability? It's a bit of a question mark yet, but if you plan ahead, give it some lees time, it will definitely increase the ageability. And it's the same with the still wine. I've made still wines years ago where, boom, we had to put it in the bottle really quick. It didn't have any lees contact, and the wine died really quickly. So same as for sparkling wines. So bottle later in the year, okay? Costs, I touched, my notes here. Yeah, the type of glass is, highly dependent, et cetera, et cetera. So quantities, as far as a mobile bottler, that's going to be important. Do you have 100 cases or 10,000 cases, right? And then you've got the tax rates, of course. Method Traditional is a little bit higher, and artificially carbonated is a little bit lower. So I'd like to address some of the misnomers of inline carbonation. I mean, years prior to my getting into this business, you hear forced carbonated, big bubbles, et cetera, et cetera. You think of, cold duck or something like that. Bad days in college, bad memories. Big bubbles get you drunk really quickly. Maybe that's why the big bubbles. But with inline carbonation, you have really small bubbles. I would bet, you put it next to somebody that makes Method Traditional, and you look at the bubble stream. There's no difference at all. Selling price per bottle, there seems to be the stigma of inline carbonated product that you can't fetch as much money as the neighbor down the road that's doing Method Traditional Brut for $25 or whatever. But I beg to differ on that. We have some customers that are selling inline carbonated for $45, not an issue at all. So think about your marketing story and how you present it. It's sparkling wine. So disadvantages, not quite as sexy, not as trendy maybe, for sure. And another disadvantage then would be the smaller batches. It takes a day to set up the traveling facility, a day to take it down, and with the smaller batches, it takes you a while to dial in the CO2 level, whether it be pre-carbonated or inline carbonated, because it's like pouring that beer into the glass. It takes a while for it to settle down. So if you're doing 75 cases or something like that, the bottling's done before you can really get things dialed in. So short and sweet.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe.
Here, I promise Craftsman Label. If you're thinking about, even if it's not sparkling wine, you want a label that will stick to the bottle and, as I say, adhere under any circumstances, contact Josh Berger there, and he'll line you up.
Cool. So one of the questions that came up in the chat was about measuring pressure in the bottle. Joe, based off of your approach, it seems like you have a relatively high level of accuracy to see what the bottle pressure is. Brianne and Kate, do either of you check bottle pressure ever after bottling or disgorging? No is an acceptable answer.
No.
No. Cool. And so I think one of the themes that we've seen across the group is intentionality, and Joe harped on this as well. I think there's a level of intentionality for sparkling wines that we should all have as we approach this, really going into harvest, but also going into the growing season. So that's kind of the start of the process. But the end of the process that I think we all forget about is glass. And glass is one of the longest lead time items that we have right now. I'll throw it out to the three of you, and any of you can speak to this. Have you, either of you or any of you, run into problems thus far sourcing glass, and what solutions are you seeing at this point for the industry?
I don't have a problem sourcing glass because I order during harvest. So as soon as my fruit comes in, I'm placing my order for the entire year, and I've done that for the last 3 years, and I think that's the only way you can not run into problems with supply chains.
For me, we moved away from flint for the traditional method, so that's helped us with supply chain issues. But then also, I mean, we buy in larger volumes, and we store whatever we don't use to make sure that we can disgorge or tirage when we want to. So I don't know if that is a solution for the industry, but that's the solution for us at the moment.
Yeah, nothing more to add on the supply chain issue. It's been a struggle. As a mobile bottler, you show up and they say, yeah, we're doing 5,000 cases, and you end up doing half of that because half the glass came from somebody else, and the bottle is so out of round that you can't get a label that wants to adhere to it. So a little trick in the industry, if you're having adherence issues with the label, or it's puckering, et cetera, the bigger that label is, the more it has to travel across a piece of glass that's not perfect. Another thing too, an issue we ran into, of course it was the first inline carbonation job that we did, was the inside diameter of the neck of the bottle was not to spec. So take a really hard look at your glass when you get it. What is the inside diameter? What happened is the sparkling wine cork was going in there, and some of them were popping out by the time they hit the end of the line. With a mobile bottling line, we have an OMBF, a wire hooding machine, that is stage 2 because you can't pack more machinery in this mobile bottling line. There's just not room, so it's a 2-step process. And the corks were blowing. It was like, oh my God, what's wrong? It was just because of that we found out. So pay attention to your glass as best you can. It's hard to be
Order glass today.
Yeah.
Everyone. Great. Well, we are just about at time. So thank you all very, very much for coming today and listening to our panelists. All three of them have promised to answer every single one of your questions that we didn't get to, so feel free to fire away after the fact. I'm kidding. There were a ton of questions. It's a really complex topic, but hopefully this helped a little bit.